Hello, everyone, and welcome to Market Talks. I'm Ray, head of markets at Cointelegraph. Here on the show, we discuss the latest in what is shaping the markets with valuable insights from industry leaders, traders, and influencers. Today's show is sponsored by Exco. On this week's episode of Market Talks, we have a very special guest, Natalie Brunell, who is a podcast host, educator, and media commentator in the Bitcoin space. Her podcast, Coin Stories, consistently ranks among the top 50 to 100 podcasts on Apple Podcasts. Previously, Natalie was an award-winning TV journalist and investigative reporter, and here is a short clip about Natalie. Hi, Natalie. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. How are you?
Great. Thanks for agreeing to come onto the show today. We're honored. You're one of the biggest podcasters in the space, one of the most impressive and impactful podcasters and educators on all things Bitcoin. So, I'm pretty excited about talking to you today.
I really appreciate that. That's very kind.
Let's dig into it. Why Bitcoin? And specifically, why now?
Well, I see Bitcoin as a tool for financial empowerment for billions of people around the world. I really believe that what the world is missing right now is economic dignity for the working person. Our current form of money is constantly manipulated and debased. And there are a small group of people essentially that make all the decisions and have the first access and advantage when it comes to printing money. And that's at everybody else's expense. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that that empowers the best of human potential and innovation and entrepreneurship. And so we need to level the playing field. And so Bitcoin is this really revolutionary technology that's akin to the printing press, that's akin to the, start of the internet. And I think it's going to change the way that we transact value across the world. The internet changed the way we all communicate and transfer information. Bitcoin's going to do the same thing for money and being able to economically transact in a more fair and predictable way. Right now, everything feels, distorted. There are no real price signals. We don't have real interest rates. There's one man at the head of the world who's deciding what the interest rate is going to be on any given month. And that's not economic stability that's going to lead to prosperity for the most people. So I really see Bitcoin as this tool for human rights and financial empowerment that I hope everyone takes the time to learn about, because right now it's harder than ever to save. We're in the United States and we're more privileged than so many other countries, and yet the middle class is declining. There's less of a sense of the American dream and young people feeling like they can afford a house or afford retirement. It shouldn't be that way. When you're working really hard, you should be able to store the value, the economic energy of the money that you make. And yet it's so hard to. Today, you have to risk it. You have to go into equities. You have to become a real estate manager or owner. You have to try to have an Airbnb. It's so hard to save. And that's because our money's manipulated, it's controlled, it's centralized. And Bitcoin is the exact opposite of that system.
You view dollar depreciation or the dollar's diminishing purchasing power over a multi-decade time span as kind of a factor in removing dignity from work?
Absolutely, because when you're working harder and harder for money that's essentially worth less and buys you less every year, that removes the motivation to do your work and to be passionate about your work and to plan for the future. I think it contributes to short-term thinking. I think it affects family values. I think it affects personal values and morality in society, because money is sort of the blood that is pumping through the economic body of our world. So we really need to address these fundamental problems, because I think the symptoms of broken money are what we see today. People feeling divided, all this opposition, us versus them, left versus right. And I don't think that we would feel so polarized and so divided if we had a system of money that we could rely on, where no matter what you wanted to do, whether you wanted to be an accountant or a hairdresser or a podcast host, you knew that there was a way to take your money and store it and save it in the future without taking so much risk and without needing to constantly think about, do you need a side hustle? Will you be able to afford a house in the future? Will your kids be able to afford a college education? We've really created a situation where we have more and more wealth concentration. Even in the pandemic, one of the biggest complaints I see from people is we created even more billionaires, right? We funneled all of this printed money we debased and stole from the working class in order to make the richest class even richer. That's not fair. That is not economic dignity. And again, I think it discourages people from feeling like they can get ahead, from feeling like they can achieve the things they want to achieve. So I think we really, really need to address that. Federal Reserve has been around since 1913, and since then the dollar has lost more than 97% of its purchasing power and value. That means that there's something wrong. And in my opinion, the problem is inflation and going further and further into debt.
That's an interesting perspective. When you talk to people about Bitcoin, how do you address kind of the elephant in the room, which is that it's too volatile, it's too risky? What's your conversation
Yeah,
that you
sure.
have with them?
Sure. So, I really relate to a lot of people because I first heard about Bitcoin in 2017 and I completely dismissed it. Because it's digital, I assumed it could be hacked or easily compromised. And I really didn't fundamentally understand money. We assume things that currently are the way they are just truths that we have to accept, like 2% inflation, for example. Over the last couple of years, we hear more and more about, I think, CPI and inflation. Maybe we didn't think about it as much 10 years ago, but what we did accept as a society is that every year things get more expensive. When we were younger, things were just cheaper. That's just the way it is. But why is that? Technology is supposed to drive prices down and make us more productive. But yet, as you pointed out, equities and real estate have been going up. We see inflation in the form of asset inflation, which more and more is out of reach for the average person. But when you think about the long term, what are some risk factors? Well, with properties, we have had real estate crashes in the past, but on top of that, there are taxes, there's maintenance. You have to think about actually taking care of a physical property. When it comes to equities, these are companies. Only 7 companies are actually making up all of the gains in the S&P 500 right now. Each company comes with a leadership team. Do you trust that leadership team 10 years from now? Do you know what that company will look like, what their products and services will be compared to competition? There's a lot of risk there that you have to weigh. And the reason that we've seen the asset inflation that we have is because, again, they're revving up that money printer, going further and further into debt, further financializing our society and monetizing the debt as a federal government. So then you look at Bitcoin, which is new, which is this revolutionary technology, very similar to the internet, decentralized, no one in control, no headquarters, no CEO, no board that you have to worry about. And it's truly scarce. There will only be these 21 million plots of land in cyberspace that you never have to maintain and purchase a new roof for. So you start to see the advantages and you start to maybe question, is there a portion of my portfolio that I can start to allocate to this asset class that is clearly here to stay, that regulators have said is a commodity, is an asset with no issuer? And then you even zoom out and maybe look at the price performance, because yes, in the short term it is volatile, but when you zoom out, it has outperformed every asset class. It has outperformed your real estate. It has outperformed the equities. And so that also speaks for itself, because I think a lot of people are looking for how can they save long term into the future? What is it that they can give to their children? How can they establish a safety net and a sense of security that will lead beyond their generation? So I think that that's what's so important to convey about Bitcoin to the average person, even if they've been skeptical about it in the past.
Right, right, right. So if you were speaking to your mother, I was speaking to my mother who's 65 about Bitcoin and trying to get her to invest. That's all pretty heady stuff, right? A lot of it is graspable because my mom's a homeowner and blah, 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 retired and all that. But for some people, financial literacy is a challenge, right? And it makes me wonder, what do people actually understand when they're talking to like Charles Schwab or their Fidelity advisor, and when you're at work and the account manager for the 401k comes in and he speaks to all the staff members at lunch about, here's your options, here's risk, da 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 da. It makes me wonder, if people don't understand Bitcoin, how much of that other conversation about just traditional finance are they understanding? So with that kind of framing, for folks who pretty much know nothing about Bitcoin and crypto, where would you suggest they start?
I really think that is a huge portion of the public that we're trying to reach. Nearly half of Americans, they don't own any stocks. And so this is really about saving. And that's how I try to convey the message the most simply, is that Bitcoin is the most powerful savings technology. I don't believe that there should be so much risk and you have to try to do stock picks or have a portfolio manager, or again, try to come up with the down payment and all the paperwork that comes with owning a house. This is literally about accumulating an asset that no one can manipulate, no one can confiscate from you. It's a true form of ownership and property in a digital format, and you can start putting away as little as $1. It's a little piggy bank. I think everyone understands the concept of saving for a rainy day. I think that saving used to be more important to just the general ethos of the American public. You save for the future. We used to be the world's biggest creditor nation, and we've lost a lot of that. The narrative has shifted to say consumerism is good, going into debt is okay, and our government is a shining example. So I think that just making Bitcoin as simple as a piggy bank, putting away as little as $1 or $5 here and there, and then letting it sit there. Set it and forget it and see what it looks like 5 years from now. Because everyone that has invested in Bitcoin and allowed it to just sit there and appreciate or dollar cost averaged in, after 5 years, and especially after 10 years, it has gone up significantly. And I think that's exactly what we need, is a form of money that will really transfer and store that economic value.
So you're a proponent of dollar cost averaging into Bitcoin.
I am, yes. I
Right.
think that's the easiest way to do it, just a little bit here and there. I think it's really hard today to walk out of your house and not spend, 5, 10, even $20. Maybe it's on a coffee, maybe you're going out for lunch. Why not also add, $5 or $10 to your Bitcoin account every single day, with the potential that that could grow significantly in the future? There's so much upside because, again, of that digital absolute scarcity.
Mm-hmm. What's your take on institutions getting back into Bitcoin again? They've had kind of a wishy-washy relationship with Bitcoin over the last 7 to 10 years. Sometimes they're into it. At the beginning, most of them were against it and said it was a Ponzi, it was for money laundering and dark markets and had no fundamental value. They go back and forth about how they feel about this asset. Now everyone's interested in it because I think the ETF applications are proof of that. But generally, how do you feel about institutions kind of stepping into Bitcoin and readopting it?
Well, I think it's not surprising seeing them change their tune and finally take this asset class seriously. I think on the one hand, they want a slice of some of that scarcity and the upside potential. And on the other, we've had some regulatory clarity. The regulators are basically saying Bitcoin is here to stay. It was not indicted in any of the lawsuits that we saw. It has been repeated that it is a digital commodity. It is an asset with no issuer. And so there's no regulatory uncertainty there the way that there is with some of the other tokens in the space. So I think institutions are starting to see that Bitcoin really is here to stay. And, there are lots of different feelings about these institutions and ETFs, for example, in the space. But in large part, I do think it's going to drive a huge wave of adoption because it's going to package Bitcoin in a familiar investment vehicle. It's going to open it up to those traditional mom and pop investors with, brokerage accounts at the massive legacy institutions. It's going to open it up for financial advisors, for pensions. So that's going to be a lot of tailwinds for Bitcoin's price. So I think we're going to see more and more adoption, but people do need to remember that as these institutions come in and provide access to these derivative products, that's not owning Bitcoin. There's still a company that you need to trust. There is counterparty risk. And so I always recommend still learning about Bitcoin enough that you feel comfortable buying it directly and then actually self-custodying it. I think that is actually the best way and captures the ethos of Bitcoin in terms of financial sovereignty, being your own bank. But I do think there's going to be a massive portion of the population that finally feels safe, finally feels like Bitcoin is accessible through these massive institutions. So maybe that'll be a first step, buy a Bitcoin ETF, and then the next step, learn about Bitcoin because you have some skin in the game. Take it off an exchange and eventually self-custody it. So I think this is just going to open up Bitcoin, and adoption will continue to grow faster and faster.
Now, I know that you speak to a lot of people across the Bitcoin community. The spectrum goes from like sovereign individuals and libertarians all the way to people that are living in Pakistan or Lebanon or Venezuela, Argentina, places where they're dealing with currency hyperinflation and just looking for a way to store wealth in a currency that's not inflating by 10,000% per week. is an option for them. So just based on kind of like your travels through those conversations, what is the general view on ETFs coming? I know that a lot of Bitcoin people are really ideological and anti-authoritarian also. So you think there would be some pushback against institutional adoption and kind of corporatizing Bitcoin, but then of course, at the same time, most people are also interested in price. Therefore, this assumption that ETFs coming will push price into the six figures territory is also desirable by those same people. So, just what's your general sense on how people feel about this ETF?
Yep, definitely both narratives are captured out there. There are people that are very skeptical of these institutions. They want people to own the asset directly. There are others that say that this is sort of that next step in the next adoption wave. And I see both sides. I mean, to make Bitcoin more accessible to the average person through a product like a Bitcoin ETF, in the long run, I think benefits everyone because they can start again with maybe that product and eventually learn more about Bitcoin and buy it directly and then take self-custody. Bitcoin is something that it's so nuanced that it takes many of us several touch points to fully understand it. So these vehicles will make it an easier on-ramp for the average person who was maybe skeptical or didn't feel comfortable investing outside of the traditional space. It'll de-geekify Bitcoin. That's what I've said on previous newscasts. But for the long run, I do think that more and more people will see the benefit of actually taking self-custody and being able to transact without one of these, massive guerrilla corporations. And around the world, you're seeing more people need Bitcoin immediately as that medium of exchange and as a hedge against far worse inflation than we see here in the US and in the West. They need it to subvert their oppressive governments and to subvert the excessive inflation that they're experiencing in many countries as those fiat currencies fail. Here in the West and in the US, I think it's first going to be that store of value, that savings technology, and then the worlds will sort of collide and merge together. So I think there's going to be, a lot of adoption. There are so many people. Again, Larry Fink said it on Fox Business News. This is an international asset. You can access it from anywhere. It is borderless, permissionless, and it's an accessible form of money because you can buy a dollar or a yen or a euro or a Nigerian naira's worth of Bitcoin, which you can't always do when it comes to stocks or a form of real property.
Yeah. I was going to actually ask you about Larry Fink and his views on digital gold. I suspect you agree.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are so many advantages to Bitcoin, and it was really great to see him acknowledge that Bitcoin is a better hedge against government money mismanagement than gold. Much of gold is centralized, it's difficult to audit. Obviously, it's physical and difficult to transport. I don't know many of my peers or other millennials who are storing away gold bars in their house. We live in a digital world, and as we move increasingly into a world of AI, the digital currency of AI, I believe, will be Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is that supercomputer network that we can truly trust. And with cryptography, I think we'll be better able to verify and authenticate data, which will be really powerful and important. And again, we need a form of money that we can save into the future that can't be debased and manipulated, that you can take anywhere around the world and you can transact at lightning speed. So I think, again, this is really, really important as far as empowerment for individuals. And I think that adoption is going to continue to grow both here, where they're talking about these Bitcoin ETFs, as well as around the world where they're using it to, purchase their daily goods at markets, which I've seen in person.
I wonder, and this is a kind of conspiratorial question you can choose not to answer, but I kind of wonder if we'll then have a world where Bitcoin custodied by major banks and money managers is therefore regulated and able to move around freely, but also tracked. That was something that we saw in these ETF applications when the SEC turned them down. They were like, we need to know who's custodying this Bitcoin. We need to know where you're getting it from. We need some insights into its movement. Agree or disagree? If you agree, resubmit. That was my interpretation of their rejection and then reapplications. So I wonder if we're approaching this world where Bitcoin that's self-custodied or not compliant with big business is somehow blacklisted and has to transact in separate markets, and then Bitcoin that's custodied by the big boys is kind of having that freedom of movement, but also not censorship proof. Do you have any views on that?
Well, I certainly hope something like that doesn't happen where you have two different classes of Bitcoin. First of all, I think that would be very, very difficult. But also, I just think that most people acknowledge that people have the right to save for the future. We don't have, different classes in terms of ownership for properties. It's just what can you afford in terms of the size of a house. We don't have that within art. We don't have that within gold. So I don't imagine that there would be, Bitcoin A and Bitcoin B. And I think that, Larry Fink also talked about that, this idea that his company, he says, is about hope. It's about hope for securing your retirement. And that's essentially what Bitcoin is going to allow people to do. Now, regulators obviously want oversight. I think the power structure that exists, people don't want to relinquish that power. There is a monopoly over our money right now. And so they're going to try to surveil any transaction they can. That's why people are so concerned about CBDCs. And so with Bitcoin, that's exactly what the SEC's issues are over the current ETF applications. It's, do they have that surveillance agreement to be able to look into a massive share of the market? That the question is, does Coinbase represent that, to see if there's any laundering, wash trading, or anything that's concerning? But this is a massive international market that's going to continue to grow. So I think that it will provide more freedom than any other form of asset class for the majority of people. And I just hope that regulators and policymakers embrace this technology and what it can do for the average working person, as opposed to, try to over regulate it or stimulate innovation or try to cut people off from, again, just being able to save for their future.
That's a fantastic answer. I want to be more optimistic, but I can also recall a number of years ago when a bunch of Bitcoin ETFs were submitted and all were rejected for a variety of reasons. So, do you have any feelings or thoughts on why one might be approved this time?
Well, from the arguments that were disclosed in the latest Grayscale lawsuit against the SEC for failing to convert GBTC into a spot Bitcoin ETF, it seemed that the SEC's main concern is, do they have enough of a watch through that sort of surveillance agreement with an exchange where they can see what's happening, and is there manipulation in the market? So with BlackRock, for example, in their latest ETF, they are arguing that with this agreement between the NASDAQ and Coinbase, which is, I believe, the largest exchange in the US, and more than 50% of the trading volume on that exchange is Bitcoin, that, hey, there is enough of a market for you to see into it here, to see and understand if there is manipulation. The SEC is going to be deciding that. Now, I personally believe that, BlackRock is trying to front run this because they know something. Perhaps, someone tipped them off and they know which way this Grayscale lawsuit is going to go. And so they want to be in line for the spot Bitcoin ETF and all of the demand that will surely rush in. But, it's a wait and see process because the SEC has really dragged their feet, and spot Bitcoin ETFs have been improved already in places like Canada. So we're a little bit behind on this. It's long overdue.
I agree. Fantastic perspective. I hear you're a first generation American, and I ask because some of the most passionate Bitcoin and crypto also advocates and supporters that I've come across have not been American. And it's because crypto, the issue with remittances, international remittances being exploitative and costly, so on and so forth. Like, these are everyday kind of financial challenges that people who don't live in America have to deal with. So for them, crypto has that immediate use case. It's not some revolutionary thing that's gonna make them rich. It just allows them to move their money around faster and for cheaper, right? So the people that I've met that are most into crypto tend to sometimes not be American. And I hear that you're a first generation American. So tell us a little bit about your backstory.
Sure. I'm first generation from Eastern Europe. My family was born in Poland, and we immigrated to the United States when I was 5 years old. And it has been really interesting to see so many people in the Bitcoin space. They kind of get it first before others. If they're international, they're from other countries and have suffered the fate of declining fiat currencies or too much government control. And that was certainly the case in my family. My family grew up under communism. So my mom has told me so many stories of, growing up, and there were food shortages. There would be a line just to get basic necessities. And sometimes she would come up to the front of the line and they would be out. And so there would be a black market that exists just in order to get something, but of course at much higher prices. There was no sense of upward social mobility. So they were very skeptical, distrustful of the government, of the press, and they really appreciated hard money. So my mom was always a gold bug. And I admire my parents because they decided in their late 30s, early 40s to still take the risk and make that transition and come to the United States, even though here they would have to start completely over. And communism had come to an end essentially in Poland, but they still thought that the opportunity, that vision of the American dream, presented them with this feeling that their kids would have a better life here. They could get an education here and achieve more than they could back in Poland. And so I really just, admire their work ethic, and it's really driven me to appreciate Bitcoin more because I had that pain point of understanding where my parents came from and the kind of government they really wanted to flee. But also, I saw them lose everything after working so hard in the great financial crisis. So just as they sort of achieved the American dream and they were able to purchase a small home in the suburbs of Chicago, the great financial crisis happened, and they were one of the 10 million American families who lost their homes and completely went under financially. And for me, I was just going into my career as a journalist, and that really lit a fire under me because I thought, how could good, hardworking people that play by the rules, that pay their taxes, they just want to contribute and be part of the middle class, how can they have the rug pulled out from under them like this? And yet the Wall Street guys, the big banks, they all get bailed out. Some of them even get bonuses. All of a sudden, I started to shift my perspective and see the future as one of sort of a rigged economy, a one that was rigged to favor the rich against the poor and the working class. And so a seed was planted, and I think I was looking for Bitcoin or looking for a solution like Bitcoin, but I just didn't know about it. And so as I would go into communities as a reporter, I would interview people from all walks of life, having the same frustrations that, every year college is getting more expensive. They don't know how to plan for their retirement. They can't afford a house, or their children feel like they can't. I realized that there's something really fundamentally broken about our money. And obviously we all have witnessed the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. So when I found Bitcoin, it was very much an aha moment because I feel like my life and my pain points prior to that really informed and prepared me to be interested and curious and want to dissect if Bitcoin really is the solution. And so the more that I studied, I realized that even though I was very skeptical at first, Bitcoin holds up to all of the arguments against it and can be that form of money that we can trust in the future.
Right. And prior to, becoming a Bitcoin and crypto content creator, you were an investigative journalist and a TV journalist. So what catalyzed that transition for you?
It was certainly not one that I planned. I thought that Bitcoin was more of my passion project and a knowledge journey that I was just doing on the side of my career. I didn't even know that you could make a career out of this. But basically, I started to learn about Bitcoin, and I pitched a couple of stories at my news networks. But for the most part, I was just covering different types of stories and topics. So I created a podcast as a hobby. I wanted to learn more, and I wanted to provide that information to the public in case anyone was interested. And the podcast slowly grew. And so I had to make a decision. Sometimes you really have to bet on yourself and jump out of the plane and build the parachute on the way down. And I just thought, this mission is so important because if Bitcoin is adopted by the world, I think that it will level the playing field and give so many more people economic opportunity to be able to, become their best versions and to become entrepreneurs, start businesses that in the past would have been easily squashed because we are so tipped to favor, mass, big business, big corporations. So I think that it will actually add to the sort of, as Preston Pysh says, the biodiversity of our economy. It will allow for more people at a sovereign level to do what they want to and to be able to save for their future. So I just thought, why not dedicate my life to educating people on this? It's really fulfilling. And that's what I did a couple of years ago. I left my news job and I focused solely on Bitcoin.
Do you find that being an independent content creator is much more challenging than just working for a company, for a media company?
Sure, there are, advantages and challenges for sure. I love being my own boss and I decide my schedule, but my schedule is now, I work 10 times harder because I am so motivated and there's so much work to be done. There are so many people to educate. There's so many false narratives out there, the FUD. And everyone really, I think, comes to Bitcoin from a different perspective and might need a different messaging angle, right? I mean, Bitcoin is apolitical. So the way that you approach someone who maybe is on the left versus the right is very different. Bitcoin is for the old and the young, but the way you approach them about saving and their future is very different. So, it takes a lot of work to try to craft those messages and to reach as many people as possible. But it's been super rewarding and fulfilling. But of course, when you go out on your own, you eat what you kill. So you have to work 10 times as hard. You're pounding the pavement and getting out there. But I certainly love that challenge, and I think that's something that drives me forward. I think capitalism and just taking on that sort of risk to create a business and to become an entrepreneur, it's so exciting and motivating, and it pushes you even when the days are difficult or long.
So there's a lot of aspiring content creators out there in the crypto space, and you've been really successful. I think you have more than 300,000 followers on your Twitter account. You're one of the top podcasts on Apple Podcasts. So what are like two major suggestions that you would give to an aspiring content creator?
I would say that the first thing is to figure out what's missing. What is your red sock? What's something that's going to stand out in the crowd and fill that void? I think that the more people we have from different backgrounds that are able to reach a specific audience, the better. And I think that one of the best things about this industry is because it's so young and new, and it hasn't really been stifled by too much regulation or red tape. It really does allow in this real competition of the value and the cream rising to the top. So if you can find what's missing and fill that void, I think it could be, both very fulfilling and very marketable. So I urge people to just, look at the space, and if they really want to contribute value, see where value is needed the most, and go for it. I think a lot of us, just in general, in whatever industry we're in, we have this negative self-talk. I think it's just human, imposter syndrome, or, comparing ourselves to others. And you're never going to know unless you try something. The answer is no until you ask. And so I've always been someone that isn't afraid to just take a risk and try. I think my journalism career helped with that because I would have to knock on doors and ask strangers all the time to talk to me. And so I lost some of that fear of just asking for permission or asking questions of even powerful people. So I just urge people to see what's missing out there. And if their skill set and their passion can fill that void, go for it. Go for it. Take the risk. And then the failures will also teach you. When you fall down, you learn a lot and you improve. I mean, nothing is easy. When I first started out in television, I certainly didn't feel comfortable in front of the camera. I felt very nervous. And it just took reps, just like in any sport, in any trade, in any skill. You just repeat, and you slowly get better. So I hope that helps.
That is fantastic advice. Before we wrap up, I'm going to present you with a scenario. It's a hypothetical. In 1 hour, you're going to meet with U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. You guys are going to have lunch, and during that time, you get to ask him 2 questions and then give him, or the Fed, 1 suggestion. What might those be?
Do you own Bitcoin? And can we please purchase Bitcoin for our balance sheet to fix our debt?
That's great.
Let's start dollar cost averaging instead of buying up those T-bills we're issuing.
That's great. That's great. Where do you think the Fed is going wrong, and how does this end? This current high inflation and all the issues where massive national debt, where does this go?
Yeah, that's what really worries me again for the future, because I certainly don't want there to be this massive deflationary event that ushers in, a Great Depression that's even worse than the 1930s. What I hope for the future is a smooth transition into an alternative system, alternative network, which is Bitcoin in my eyes. Because the way that we have structured our system based on credit and based on issuing more and more debt, it's just not sustainable. So the more that we print, the more we devalue money and we essentially steal from the working class. And we can't reverse that very easily. We can't just create productivity. You cannot print poverty out of existence. You can't just issue more dollars in order to fix these problems. We need to actually spur growth and savings. And I don't think we can do that anymore in our current system. So I think we need an alternative, and we need one that's going to provide a life raft that people can walk onto peacefully and safely over, a time period, so that it's not this seismic shift that's really devastating to a lot of people. I don't think that 10, 20 years from now, the picture of currencies around the world is going to look the same. I think the dollar is going to continue to weaken in terms of how many transactions are actually settled in dollars. We're already seeing it with things like the BRICS and other nations saying that they're going to create their own payment rails. We're seeing it obviously with digital currencies. And I think that we need something that everyone can trust, that again is this international asset class that no one can manipulate. There is no central bank with Bitcoin that people can start to slowly walk onto and learn more and more about. So that's really my hope for the future, because otherwise, I just see no matter who's in charge of the Federal Reserve, it's a very difficult job because of the mess that we're already in and the mess we created with all the quantitative easing and monetizing the debt. They have to continue to print. Otherwise, we're insolvent. And so that's why I'm so passionate about Bitcoin. We need a fix. The problem is inflation and debt. The solution is Bitcoin.
Well said. I really appreciate you coming on today, and I think the audience has a lot to chew on and to consider if anyone in the audience is not yet holding Bitcoin. Of course, nothing that Natalie or I said was financial advice, and investors are encouraged, like any asset, to do your own research and proceed with caution and know that you could lose everything. So neither of us are commanding that you go and buy Bitcoin, even though we might think that it's a good idea and both of us hold Bitcoin. Natalie, if the audience wants to know more about you and hear more of your insights, where are the best places for them to find you?
Sure. So I release weekly episodes of my podcast, Coin Stories. You can find that on YouTube and all the podcast streaming platforms. And I'm very active on Twitter at Nat Brunell.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. That was a fantastic conversation. Viewers, you've been watching Market Talks. We're here every Thursday at 12 ET. So hope to see you all next Thursday.